Iran hits back at a U.S. threat to impose sanctions after a United Nations arms ban on the Islamic Republic expires. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Iran is celebrating what it believes is a diplomatic victory after the UN lifted a 13-year arms embargo on the Islamic Republic, allowing the nation to buy and sell weapons without UN approval. Moments after the announcement, the White House issued a statement of its own, threatening to slap sanctions on any country engaging in arms sales with Iran. The United States tried and failed to extend the arms embargo. That was back in August, but the UN, along with European allies France, Germany, and the UK, dismissed those efforts as having no legal basis. That's because the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. For more on U.S.-Iran tensions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Tehran, Hassan Ahmadian is professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Tehran. Maya Lester is an international sanctions lawyer with Brick Court Chambers. She's joining us from London. Also in London, Ian Black is a visiting senior fellow of Middle East Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And with us here in Washington, Barbara Slavin is director and non-resident senior fellow, Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And I want to welcome all of you to the program. Hassan, why don't I start with you? Because Iran's foreign minister says that this is momentous. It's both a diplomatic and military victory in a sense. Yet skeptics say it's more a symbolic victory, if any victory at all, because Iran now, with its dire financial situation, really can't afford to buy weapons. So give me your sense of what this really means.
Well, it comes as a result of U.S. unilateral approach towards Iran. The United States was dealt two failed efforts in recent months. Basically last month in the Security Council and in its effort to snap back sanctions on Iran, both failed, and we are in election times in the U.S. So that's I think this new round of sanctions is part of that effort to say that the United States is still keeping its maximum pressure on Iran. But in Iran, well, lifting the sanctions against all U.S. effort is important because beyond the symbolism of it, it reflects the failure of the U.S. unilateral approach to Iran. And it's not only about Iran importing arms, as you alluded to, but it's about Iran also being able to sell arms as well, which I think is what Iran will focus on in the coming months and years. It's another source of revenue for Iran. Now, there are, as we speak, there are 27 countries under U.S. Sanctions, ergo 27 potential markets for Iranian arms, which are advanced in some aspects, and there are buyers for them. So it's not only about importing, but it's also about exporting in this sanctioned economy. So it's partly, I think, relevant to, economically relevant to the sanctions as well, and Iran will get some resources of hard currency that it is really in dire need of.
And Barbara, you've been following Iran for several years. I mean, is that how you see it as well? I mean, it's so easy to focus on export, imports, and maybe just one aspect and not the other. What about what Hassan's talking about here?
Yeah, I think it's more than a symbolic victory. I think it's a concrete victory for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, which is still alive despite all the many blows that have been struck against it. It's a victory for European diplomacy. It's a victory for Iranian diplomacy, the Russians and the Chinese. So I think it is important. If the U.S. had been able to somehow snap back sanctions on Iran, I think that would have seriously damaged the agreement. As it is now, the JCPOA is still alive, and that means that if Joe Biden is elected president on November the 3rd, and if he takes office next year, he has something that he can return to. So I think that's very important. However, Iran, as you pointed out, is in terrible economic situation, and primarily it's because of inflation, which is very, very high. So I think, this is not going to be the solution for the Iranian economy.
Yeah, we'll drill a little deeper on those issues. But let me ask you about U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He says any country that gets involved in arms sales with Iran will face sanctions. Obviously, he's speaking, I would think, to Russia and China. How do you read that?
Well, I mentioned that the U.S. would go after any companies it can identify that are providing weapons to Iran. But, again, because sanctions have been so overused, they are losing their efficacy. And there are non-dollar means, barter means even, of carrying on these transactions. I also think Tehran made a very important point about the fact that Iran will sell weapons. There are a lot of countries in Africa, for example, even Iraq has bought Iranian ammunition and drones, things like that, that Iran can market because it has quite a big defense industry that it's built up on its own.
Maya, let me ask you about the European signatories to the Iran nuclear deal. We're talking about France, Germany, the UK. They were hoping for a voluntary 18-month extension of the arms deal. They failed to get China and Russia on board with that. Instead, they're going to rely on an EU embargo. Explain for us what that would entail.
Can I just back up a little and just explain exactly what has and hasn't happened here? So under the terms of the deal, and Barbara is certainly right to say that the deal is still in existence, this arms embargo on Iran was always going to expire now. Now that's what's happened. That means legally it is possible for the likes of Russia and China to export, to do deals to export arms to Iran. Whether that will in fact be in their strategic interest, we'll have to see. And whether US sanctions mean, and the Iranian economy, mean that those countries or others will in fact be able to supply and do those major arms deals, we have yet to see. What the US tried to do is suggest that the United Nations sanctions should snap back. That was rejected simply because the US had withdrawn from the nuclear deal, and therefore, if you like, they could no longer say it's time for UN sanctions to snap back because Iran hasn't complied. But what the US then did is really important. The US said, fine, if we can't have UN sanctions snap back, we will impose our own extremely significant unilateral sanctions on Iran. And this is where the US holds real economic power, because the dollar is so significant worldwide that what the US can say is, if you supply arms to Iran, which we don't like, we will impose sanctions, secondary, really important extraterritorial sanctions on anyone who does something that we don't like in Iran, namely trades in arms with Iran. Now, and that is a very powerful weapon that the US has as a unilateral matter of its own powers. Now, you're right to say that the EU signatories, and indeed Russia and China, those who wish to see the Iran nuclear deal upheld, are trying to make sure that the deal stays in place, because their view is that it will be more effective in trying to ensure that Iran doesn't have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon, that we stay within the terms of the deal. And so what the EU are trying to do is find routes to permit lawful trade with Iran, and also to make it unlawful in the EU to comply with these US extraterritorial sanctions. So we have quite a complex web of different factors at play here. But what has just happened is simply that the arms embargo has been lifted that was always going to be lifted.
And you say it is a complex web. This is stuff that you're very familiar with. It's complicated stuff, talking about compliance, breaches, and then you have an election in about 13 days. You don't know who's going to be in charge after November 3rd. So what kind of questions are you facing? How do you analyze all of that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to know how much difference the US election will make. I mean, certainly President Trump has made no secret of the fact that he thinks the Iran nuclear deal is terrible. He withdrew the US from it. Joe Biden has certainly been warmer to that deal. So we'll have to see. It could be that there is a big difference in the way that the US approaches the Iran nuclear deal. But my assessment is that the US's unilateral, very significant imposition on sanctions of Iran, which have this very powerful effect on the world's financial markets, is unlikely to be unraveled completely, whatever we see happening in the US election.
Interesting. Ian, let me ask you about this article in The Guardian. It says Iran's defense spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $18.4 billion last year. That's about 3.5 of the country's GDP. It's dwarfed significantly by Saudi Arabia, which spent about $80 billion. Talk to me about the change in terms of a balance of power in terms of arms in the region. Is this going to have any impact, do you think?
Well, you're right to point out that the Saudis spend far more than the Iranians, and also with their allies, the UAE, and of course Israel too. I think a very significant factor in all this, in the background, but highly relevant, is the recent agreement between the Israelis, the UAE, and Bahrain. The Iranians are very, very upset by that. They've condemned the agreement known as the Abraham Accords, and they fear that one result may be to allow Israel to obtain a foothold in the Gulf region. Now, of course, the Israeli, Emirati and Bahraini and Saudi relationship have been going on below the horizon, as it were, for many years. But the formalization of this agreement, and obviously people have their motives, particularly President Donald Trump, but the Iranians are very upset by that, and I think that is part of the context. Also relevant is the fact that the Iranians are, if you like, in a very weak position because of the effect of UN sanctions, and particularly the reimposed American sanctions, and of course their own difficulties with the coronavirus pandemic. So the Iranians will want to certainly increase their defense and even offensive capabilities, but I'm not sure how much they'll be able to do that in reality.
Hassan, let me get your thoughts on that. Is Iran weakened, and are they annoyed rather with the Abraham Accords?
Well, of course it is, because you see, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel have been importing so much weapons the past years and decades, Iran, with its domestic capacity, was able to balance them and balance their capabilities and balance the U.S. presence in the region. Now they are trying to create, under the with the support of the United States, a front against Iran. This is how it is viewed in Tehran, and given a way for Israel in the Persian Gulf is seen as a bringing an art foe to Iran's mainly adjacent waters. So that's why Iranians are not only annoyed, they are very angry about this, and I think they will not hesitate to face any sort of implications on this new deal with UAE and Bahrain. But beyond that, I think Iranians, the notion that Iran cannot buy that much weapons is not that much relevant to Iran's case pre-arms embargo. You see, if you go before 2007, Iran did not import that much of weapons. Iran's defense doctrine is based on the reality that the world denied Iran weapons when it was in dire need of during the 8-year war. So the doctrine turned to internal capacity of building what Iran needs in terms of defense. Now, of course, it needs a bit in here and a bit in there to enhance its capacity, but it's not the case that Iran will go for huge buys This is not true. This has not been true previously, and I don't think that has changed, because under the arms embargo, Iran's defense capability and defense industry was really booming, and you see it in the fact that Iran's internally produced defense system hits a U.S. highly complicated spy drone in Iran's territorial waters last year, or other cases, Iran's very precise targeting of the U.S. base in Iraq and Ain al-Assad this year in January. So Iran's defense industry has been booming despite the sanctions, and I don't think that Iran is that much in need of importing a lot of arms. So that's not a reality, of the Iranian defense case now.
And Hassan, Tehran's hitting back on the U.S. threats to impose sanctions, saying that this kind of shows the futility of U.S. action and rhetoric on sanctions. In fact, the foreign minister spoke to CNN journalist Fareed Zakaria recently, just last month. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The United States has exerted all the pressure it could on Iran. It had hoped that these sanctions will bring our population to their knees. It didn't. That's why they withdrew from JCPOA. That's why they started maximum pressure. That's why they took a resolution to the Security Council. That's why after they failed, they started the so-called process of snapback. And I have to say that the word snapback doesn't appear in either JCPOA or Security Council Resolution 2231. And they failed.
So Hassan, I want to get your reactions to his comments.
Of course it didn't work, because you see no result, no political result, no strategic result came as a result of U.S. maximum pressure. That's obvious. I mean, the 12 points that Pompeo brought up, none of them were accomplished as a result of the maximum pressure. So the United States, that sought to bring Iran to its knees, is now resorting to anti-humanitarian trade with Iran, with the sanctioning of Iranian very last financial channels with the Europeans that were used to import some medicine for very special medicine to special diseases that Iran couldn't produce or can't produce within. So it's resorting basically to mass penalizing all Iranians because they didn't rose up against the Iranian system despite the U.S. efforts by sanctioning them and trying to get them out to topple the regime, as they put it. But that didn't happen, so the policy was a failed policy, and the results are not to U.S. advantage or the U.S. desire.
Maya, let me bring you back into the conversation, because at the State Department just the other day, Mike Pompeo once again talking about sanctions. So let's listen to what he had to say.
This week we made good on our promise made in June that when we said we would sanction commercial entities doing business with the Islamic Republic of Iran regime and their shipping lines. 6 entities and 2 individuals have now been designated. It's a warning to anyone doing business with this company.
I think he meant to say with this country, but give me your sense, again, you said that those words do carry a lot of weight.
Yes, absolutely. So my sense is that does the US's policy towards Iran work? The reason that's such a challenging question is, what is the US policy designed to achieve? If the US policy is designed to hurt the Iranian economy and to make international trade with Iran much more challenging, particularly the financing of that trade, undoubtedly it has had that effect. But if the question is, has US policy resulted in Iran not being able to enrich uranium and not being able to have stockpiles, then the impact on its missile and nuclear program is much more questionable. And it's also certainly the case that even the EU partners in the Iran deal are concerned about Iranian possible non-compliance and have triggered, indeed, the dispute resolution mechanism questioning Iran's compliance with the deal themselves. So it's also undoubtedly true that the Iranian people have not sort of risen up if regime change is what the US is trying to achieve. And there is certainly a good argument that the people who have been strengthened by this are the hardliners in Iran, and US has made negotiation much less likely. So my basic view here is that US sanctions are very powerful internationally. It would be impossible to argue with that position, that it is US unilateral sanctions that strike fear into the heart of the international banking community, and therefore the US has succeeded in chilling trade with Iran. Is that a good thing? Probably not from the perspective of the Iranian people. Is it achieving anything as regards Iran's enrichment program? Who knows? Probably not either. Is it achieving some other foreign policy goal of President Trump to be hardline when it comes to Iran? Quite possibly.
You know, Barbara, as long as we're talking about this maximum pressure attempt, it's been interesting. I've read some accounts, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that actually within Iran, public support has actually been galvanized because of the sanctions, and not just that, the assassination of General Soleimani, that, you know, you used to have all these people, but now they kind of have coalesced around the foreign policy of Iran. Do you see that as the case, and what has been the overall extent of the maximum pressure campaign?
Look, it's very hard to read public opinion in Iran. I would say that the regime has coalesced around a rather hardline policy. Ordinary people, on the other hand, are suffering greatly. Their currency has lost an enormous amount of value. Inflation is terrible. They're having trouble even getting food and medicine. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they've coalesced around the government. But it is true that that Iranian policies have not changed. Look, Iran's defense is not based on what Javad Zarif calls beautiful weapons. It's based on nurturing groups in the region that are like-minded, militias in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, that are supporting Iranian goals to kick the United States out of the region. This is where Iran's policy has been successful, at least in Iranian terms, over the last 40 years. And sanctions have not had a big impact on that. They've reduced the amount of money Iran has to throw at some of these groups, but they have not changed the ideological fervor. And frankly, this is a policy that's relatively cheap compared to the billions of dollars that the Saudis and Emiratis and others spend on weapons. So, you know, the real question is, what was the goal? I see a lot of domestic politics, frankly, in President Trump's Iran policy. I think he pulled out of the JCPOA because some of his supporters wanted him to do that, supporters in the United States, and that was really the main reason for it. There are Christian fundamentalists, there are right-wing Jewish groups that are very supportive of Bibi Netanyahu and Israeli policy, and he's looking at domestic issues, especially in the run-up to his potential re-election or election loss.
Ian, let me ask you about the U.S. It's maintaining that Iran now has the capacity to sell weapons to its proxies. Hezbollah, of course, comes to mind. Of course, the United States has sold arms to Saudi Arabia, which is being used in Yemen. And I think Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman kind of talked about what they see as a double standard here. Let's listen to what he had to say.
China's military export policies and practices reflect a highly responsible attitude. On the contrary, it is the U.S. that is peddling arms and ammunition everywhere, uses military trade to serve geopolitical interests, and even openly interferes in the internal affairs of other countries and withdrawing from the Arms Trade Treaty. It has no right to make irresponsible remarks on China.
Ian, give me your sense of how you take those comments.
The question is whether China will risk, in the light of the impending American election, risk increasing their arms supplies to Iran. And it's an important point to note that there are rumors of an impending Chinese-Iranian strategic deal. And that's, I don't know whether any public information is available about that, but it's certainly something of relevance to this conversation. The question is, if Joe Biden wins the American election in just a few weeks' time, will the Chinese want to annoy him by striking such a deal with Tehran? I think that the international response will be relief that President Trump is no longer in the White House, in the Oval Office, and that things will improve under a democratic president who has vowed to rejoin, obviously with certain conditions, the JCPOA, which is obviously important, will be an important change in terms of America's international policies. So I think that it's important to emphasize, if you like, the role of the impending American election, and the stakes are very, very high, as I think we all know.
Hassan, let me ask you about that. Fareed Zakaria talked to Zarif at the Council on Foreign Relations. This was back in September. He asked him if he'd be willing to renegotiate the JCPOA, and he said absolutely not, and he said it over and over and over again. He says it's immaterial who's in the White House, but will it make a difference if Joe Biden, as the polls suggest, wins this election? How does that change the relationship between the United States and Iran?
No, he has penned a piece on the CNN saying that he will return on a compliance for compliance, basically rationale to the JCPOA. The tone that he and his would-be foreign policy team is using vis-a-vis Iran is way different from the tone that the Trump administration is using. But again, it's basically the policy that matters, not the tone, not the rhetoric. Now, we have to wait and see, and there's a huge debate here in Iran as to what sort of change would happen if Biden wins the election, and how to respond to that change. I think it totally depends on how the new administration would act, what its concrete steps would be after being elected with regards to the JCPOA and with regards to the tone that it uses against Iran, with regards to the Trump policy and the sanctions that he imposed on Iran during the past 3 years, and vis-a-vis the JCPOA, of course. The JCPOA now, the discussion is whether the United States should be allowed back into the JCPOA or not, and what sort of guarantees that the Biden administration would provide that another U.S. administration won't pull another Trump on Iran and renege on its commitments. That's a sort of a skepticism and mistrust about the future of a U.S. approach to Iran will be overshadowing Iran's response to the U.S. maybe change after a Biden would-be administration.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. It's been a robust discussion. Thanks so much. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.